And Benjamin, one of the big things that the EU is very keen to crack down on, not just the EU, many governments around the world, but is disinformation. It seems as if it's sort of an article of faith among elites now that if we just stop people from talking rubbish on the internet, then life will go back to normal. We could go back to a time before 2016 when all these horrible political events, were started to trouble us. What do you make of that conversation? Because you've written a really excellent long read on this for us this week.
Yes, and I'm delighted at the opportunity to appear again in Spiked with that piece. But first, I think your analysis of the oversized interest in Musk is brilliant. It is a purely media-driven interest, and it is entirely owing to Twitter, or what the platform formerly known as Twitter, but that it's, and I don't know any of my neighbors, for instance, who are on Twitter. My neighbors they're just like regular people. Like, why would they be on Twitter? They're on they're on Facebook exchanging recipes and cat videos. And, it's like, so it is a incredibly sort of narrow segment of the population that's determining this entire discussion and debate. And then, as far as disinformation, I was just sort of at your urging and sort of reframing a part of that piece on disinformation. It just the blindingly obvious finally occurred to me that so much of the suspicion about what we now call disinformation, I think, is rooted in two seismic political events: the 2016 election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum, both of which I think, and the only explanation that so many people could come up with that would encompass those outcomes was that the mob, the people, were deliberately misinformed, and that we have to manipulate them to reach the right conclusions. You all over here had a terrible event, the murder of 3 children. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is there any doubt about this, that the spark, not the underlying cause, but the spark of those that ignited those events, or those riots, was misidentification of the perpetrator?
Absolutely, yes. As a Muslim asylum seeker, before we knew the name of the real suspect.
Right. Yeah. Now, I mean, there hasn't been the same kind of event, I don't believe, in the United States that can be so directly tied to a piece of misinformation or disinformation. Let's say for a moment that the attacker had been an asylum seeker. I would expect that to be underreported, that wouldn't be something that would be a piece of information that, for all sorts of reasons, and one could argue that, people with good intentions wouldn't want to accentuate that piece of information. It wasn't that. Do you believe that however that achieved its purchase on social media, was that piece of erroneous information something that was deliberately sown, or was that something that people assumed might have
people wanted to believe
they
it.
wanted to believe
because
it.
It was something that was not just shared on Twitter. It was something that people were sharing privately, very widely. I went to speak to people in Southport, and within not very long of hearing about the attack, suddenly they're hearing about this name, this erroneous name, because people want to know.
Yeah.
And then it fits a certain profile, that level of nihilistic crime, one assumes an Islamist motivation or something like that. There's certain, kind of archetypes that kick into play.
And in the past, and again, on the one hand, one has to be very careful not to excuse or the riots or the disinformation that sparked the riot. But on the other hand, one wants to explain it.
Yeah.
And don't you think the following is true, that there have been instances of knife crime and of Islamist violence that have been perpetrated, and that either the Islamist element of it or even the ethnic minority element of it has not been forthcoming?
So even earlier this year in Hartlepool, there was a terror attack, horrific string of murders, and all we knew was that there was a terror attack, and we couldn't report on any of the other features. So, already this year you have an example where that kind of thing is downplayed. You create suspicions among the public that if people assume now, rightly or wrongly, unfortunately, that if they haven't been told X, Y, Z, then that must be the cause of it. And that's obviously a very dangerous place for us to be in.
And I also think there's a very strong case that whilst in the wake of the riots and the anti-Muslim misinformation that was flying around and whatever, the tendency is to say, well, the answer therefore is to censor this person, these kinds of accounts, whatever. I think there's a pretty strong argument that the environment which allowed that misinformation to spread so quickly was also created by censorship to a certain extent, by which I mean a lot of the influencers on the hard right and far right who were pumping out that stuff, many of them very cynical operators. These people who have been given martyr status by the fact that they've been kicked off of social media platforms, but put back on Musk's X. These are people who have been given the status of truth teller despite lying all the time because of the fact they're the ones who have been willing to occasionally utter uncomfortable truths, even if they're trying to push it in a bigoted and unpleasant direction. And also, I think that general sense that the public weren't being trusted, that if we give you too much information, you're just going to kind of fly off the handle. You create a kind of seed bed for this kind of, for this sort of misinformation and for a sort of level of, for those narratives to take root, quite quickly. I mean, it's worth saying that obviously even in terms of the riots nationwide, you are talking about hundreds of people in a nation of tens of millions. But the lack of appreciation, a general kind of sense of gaslighting, a general sense of it doesn't do to talk about certain things, a general sense in which we do not really trust you to talk about these issues because we naturally assume that if we had an open debate about any of the deep-seated problems we talked about, whether it's Islamist extremism, knife crime, whatever, that you'll draw the wrong conclusions, has created a small but not insignificant audience for misinformation, hard right narratives, and so on. Like that's kind of inevitable. I think there was a very clear sense in which the desire to close down discussions around these various things made it more likely for people not to listen to and to take as read what the authorities were telling them. But to just listen to these people spouting nonsense. It's kind of, you can kind of draw a line between those things to a certain extent, I think.
And also social media is a bit of a red herring in all of this, because we were talking last week about the Birmingham riots in 2005. And that was kicked off by a piece of entirely fake news about an Asian, a black woman supposedly being raped by an Asian woman. Again, often these rumors fit into something. They fit into certain conditions and they thrive. And Benjamin, in your piece actually for Spiked, you talk about how this idea that it's unique that lies spread quickly in today's age is nonsense, right?
Right. Well, I mean, just to go back for a moment, I mean, Tom, you so succinctly and elegantly made the point that I was fumbling toward, which is that it's really odd because it seems to me that the only lesson that I would draw or would feel safe in drawing from both the disinformation and from the riots that were sparked by that disinformation is that you want to encourage a full and complete discussion of everything on social media. So in other words, which is not to say that the truth will inevitably emerge, and it will emerge in a not messy and in some way unpleasant way. But that when people feel that information is being withheld from them, that's exactly the occasion when rumors and conspiracy theories arise.
Yeah.
And, this is absolutely, I don't know. I believe it was the same thing with the acid attack. There was the same thing. And I even heard about this in the US. I said, and my immediate reaction when I was not told anything about the identity of the, initially of the attackers, I assume that there's an element of this person's identity that for whatever reason, the BBC doesn't want to, or doesn't feel comfortable disclosing. This is absolutely true, of course, in the United States, where it's become a matter of policy not to identify the race or ethnicity of certain certain criminals, and that just now, as far as disinformation specifically, I don't know what disinformation is. I mean, there's a small, I guess actually it would be those who are deliberately spread, they know the information is false. Yeah. And for cynical, political, or other purposes, they are seeding this false information. But that is an incredibly small element of what is regarded as disinformation. The notion that ideas that people find inconvenient or dangerous or unenlightened or too enlightened are going to spread and going to spread quickly is at least as old as the printing press. I mean, that was exactly what people saw as the danger of the printing press. It seems to me that all of this discussion it really kind of evinces what E.P. Thompson called the condescension of posterity, that people don't see that there is really nothing new under the sun, and that it's not all, and the ideas, I mean, people say, well, it's more dangerous now. Well, the 30 Years' War was plenty dangerous. I mean, it killed, it's just, it's incredibly, yes, when people feel passionately about certain beliefs, and that they are either suppressed or allowed to give full vent to them, often, incredibly ugly things follow. But that is no reason to suppress the dissemination of information. Yeah. And it is what is horrible about all of this, as you all know, it's that, it's disinformation until it turns out that it's the truth. Obviously
many such cases.
Yes, it's just, but it is just remarkable. Obviously the Hunter in the US, the Hunter Biden laptop story is, a great instance of that. But in the United States, and I'm wondering if this is more true in the United States, I guess it's probably, I'm just more familiar with the sort of the political and history and foreign policy of the United States, is that so many dissenting ideas on foreign policy were suppressed as disinformation until they turned out to be absolutely right. This goes back to, actually even the U.S. entry into the Second World War. Most people think that was the right decision. It's not as if that wasn't protected by a bodyguard of lies. It's not as if, but certainly in the case of the Vietnam War, again, people for absolutely, for what they believed were admirable and noble reasons, were incredibly dishonest to the public. Yeah. And so it's really, disinformation to me is really only disfavored information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sometimes, but that's not to say that there aren't going to, it's not sometimes going to be partially true and sometimes entirely false. And
that there is such a thing as misinformation. There is such a thing as disinformation, but that's not really what certainly the establishment is talking about. Yeah. Not least because it seems to rest on this incredibly naive idea that disinformation is what foreign governments do. It's not what our government would possibly do. And it is interesting where I think this is probably true across the piece in terms of the UK as well as America. But even some of the people who have perpetrated some of the most disastrous, barbarous lies of recent years. So you think of the dodgy dossier and our entrance into the Iraq War. You know, Alistair Campbell, Blair's spin doctor, is not only someone who is, you know, he's invited onto television programmes to hold forth on the importance of truth in public life, and he spent many years bashing Boris Johnson on this basis. He's been running around in recent days on social media talking about how, you know, I don't know, Elon Musk needs to be extradited or whatever the case might be, trying to cancel various people. And yet this is someone whose fingerprints are all over one of the most disastrous pieces of disinformation, which came with an incredibly high body count, which destabilised the whole region. And it's just a clear reminder that even though there is such a thing as misinformation and disinformation, this is basically just a war on dissent at this point. That's become absolutely crystal clear. And you see it in so many different instances, particularly where now it's become kind of almost, rather than even someone saying, I disagree with that, it's like, oh, that's just nonsense. Oh, that's misinformation. That's lie. Like, it's almost become a reflex on the part of essentially kind of establishment pundits and mouthpieces that they use this language now because they know it's got some sort of purchase, to just dismiss it as you can't really even hold that opinion. You must be getting it from somewhere else because it's a kind of weapon in their armory now. Incredibly.
And I think that actually is something that's new in the political debate and discussion, because, I mean, if you go back to something like, I mean, this almost seems quaint and innocuous, the debate in the 1960 U.S. presidential election between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Nixon always, you know, serving as the convenient villain of the piece, but Kennedy talked about a missile gap. He was saying that, you know, we have to have a more assertive policy against the Soviet Union, and we have to, and the Republican administration has allowed this inequality in nuclear weapons to develop. Not only was that entirely not true, Kennedy knew it was entirely not true. And now, no one at the time, even when that was, it's like, it was those sort of in the know, even at the time, knew what Kennedy was doing. And, you know, obviously Nixon knew what Kennedy was doing. That's kind of like, that's politics. But that, and it was terrible. I mean, it was terrible. It was terrible in that it also, it literally increased the risk of nuclear war between the superpowers, because it made the whole discussion about the U.S.-Soviet rivalry all the more heated, et cetera, drove up defense spending and more. But the idea now that your political opponent is not only wrong, but is not only lying, but is lying and is probably in service of a foreign government. That is unbelievably damaging to anything resembling, sort of political debate and discussion, or a reasonable political debate and discussion.
And this stuff serves also to kind of whitewash the previous administrations and governments that have lied through their teeth, as you suggest. I mean, there was this thing post-Brexit and post-Trump where commentators would go around as if political lying was invented in 2016. Like it had never happened before. No one had ever, spun something, outright lied to the public. And it was a fascinating kind of point in which suddenly various sins were absolved. Suddenly George W. Bush becomes quite a cuddly figure in American politics. Like all of these things took place. And I thought it was fascinating how quickly that took place. Where out of the sort of populism panic, it suddenly becomes the old establishment was actually much better. And even if they didn't want to admit this in public, it was like they might have lied, but at least their heart was in the right place or whatever,